I'm Sarah, 29 years old, and I've always been the family disappointment. Last Easter, sitting at my parents' perfectly set dining table in their pristine suburban home, I thought maybe this time would be different. Maybe this time they'd finally see that my unconventional path had led somewhere meaningful. I was wrong, dead wrong. As I tried to share news about my latest documentary being accepted into Sundance, my mother's voice sliced through the cheerful Easter conversation like a blade through silk. "You're an embarrassment to this family," she declared, her words echoing off the polished walls of our childhood home. Every face at that table turned toward me with a mixture of pity and agreement that made my stomach drop. But then Marcus, my bodyguard, leaned down and whispered something in my ear that changed everything. What he told me didn't just shift the power dynamic at that table. It revealed secrets that would rock our entire family to its core. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Growing up as the youngest Johnson child in Westfield, Connecticut, meant living in the shadow of two incredibly successful siblings who seemed to effortlessly check every box on my parents' list of acceptable life choices. My sister Emma had graduated summa cum laude from Yale Medical School and was now a pediatric surgeon at Hartford Hospital, married to David, a corporate attorney who specialized in mergers and acquisitions. My brother Jake had built his financial advisory practice from nothing into a thriving business that managed portfolios for some of the wealthiest families in our county, and he was engaged to Lauren, whose father owned a chain of luxury automobile dealerships across New England. Then there was me, Sarah, the dreamer, the troublemaker, the one who couldn't seem to understand that success meant safety, stability, and social respectability. From an early age, I saw the world differently than my family. While Emma was memorizing anatomical charts and Jake was studying market trends, I was the kid with a camera, documenting the stories that others preferred to ignore. I filmed the homeless veteran who lived behind our local grocery store, interviewed the immigrant families who worked double shifts at the textile factory on the outskirts of town, and created short documentaries about issues that made my parents uncomfortable at their country club gathering. My mother, Linda Johnson, had built her real estate career by specializing in luxury homes for executives relocating to Connecticut. She understood the importance of image, of maintaining the right connections, of never giving people ammunition to question your family's standing in the community. My father, Robert, had worked his way up from a small insurance office to owning one of the most successful agencies in the state. Together they had crafted a life that looked perfect from the outside: the colonial house with the manicured lawn, the vacation home on Cape Cod, the children who had followed acceptable career paths and married within their social circle. Except for me, when I dropped out of my business administration program at UConn to pursue journalism and documentary filmmaking, the disappointment in our house was palpable. My parents saw it as a rejection of everything they'd worked to build, a deliberate choice to embrace instability and controversy, when I could have had security and respectability. They watched me struggle through unpaid internships at local news stations, scrape together funding for independent film projects, and gradually build a reputation in circles they didn't understand or respect. What they failed to recognize was that my unconventional path was leading somewhere significant. My first major documentary exposing corruption in our local city council had resulted in 3 resignations in federal investigations that recovered millions in misappropriated funds. The project earned me recognition from the Connecticut Society of Professional Journalists and opened doors to larger, more complex stories. My second film, documenting the experiences of domestic violence survivors, had been picked up by a streaming platform and viewed by over 2 million people, leading to policy changes in how law enforcement handled these cases. But it was my latest project that had truly elevated my career to a level my family couldn't ignore, even if they didn't want to acknowledge it. For the past 18 months, I had been investigating human trafficking networks operating along the Interstate 95 corridor between New York and Boston. The work was dangerous, requiring me to go undercover in truck stops, massage parlors, and other locations where victims were being exploited. The stories I uncovered were heartbreaking but necessary: young women and men who had been lured from their home countries with promises of legitimate work, only to find themselves trapped in situations of forced labor and sexual exploitation. The investigation had put me in contact with federal task forces, immigration advocates, and law enforcement agencies across multiple states. It had also put me in danger. The criminal networks I was exposing had resources, connections, and a willingness to eliminate threats to their operation. After receiving the third death threat in a month, my editor at the independent news organization funding the project insisted I hire professional security. That's how Marcus entered my life. Marcus Rodriguez was a former Navy SEAL who had transitioned into private security after completing 2 tours in Afghanistan and 1 in Iraq. At 34, he brought a level of professionalism and competence to his work that immediately put me at ease. More importantly, he understood the significance of what I was trying to accomplish. Having seen firsthand the human cost of exploitation and trafficking in conflict zones, Marcus appreciated the importance of bringing these stories to light, even when it meant accepting personal risk. Over the months we worked together, Marcus had become more than just my protection detail. He was my sounding board, my voice of reason when I wanted to pursue a lead that might be too dangerous, and increasingly, my closest friend. His military intelligence background gave him insights into the criminal networks I was investigating, and his contacts in law enforcement often provided valuable information that enhanced my report. What I didn't realize was how those same contacts and his intelligence-gathering skills would soon reveal secrets much closer to home. The weeks leading up to Easter had been particularly intense. My trafficking documentary had been accepted into the Sundance Film Festival, a recognition that represented the pinnacle of independent filmmaking achievement. I had also learned that I was being considered for a Peabody Award, one of journalism's most prestigious honors. For the first time in my adult life, I felt like I had undeniable proof that my unconventional career choices had been worth the struggle and family disappointment. I was excited to share this news with my family at our traditional Easter brunch, hoping that maybe these achievements would finally help them understand that I hadn't been wasting my life pursuing impossible dreams. I had built something meaningful, something that was making a real difference in the world. Easter morning dawned bright and clear, the kind of perfect spring day that made Westfield look like a postcard of suburban prosperity. I had spent an hour getting ready, choosing a conservative lavender dress that would meet my mother's approval standards, and styling my hair in a way that looked professional but not too casual. I even convinced Marcus to wear a suit instead of his usual tactical gear, hoping he could blend in as my boyfriend rather than obviously being security. As we drove through the familiar streets of my childhood neighborhood, past the perfectly maintained lawns and flowering dogwood trees, Marcus could sense my nervousness. "You sure you want me there for this family gathering?" he asked, adjusting his tie with obvious discomfort. In my experience, family dynamics can be more dangerous than some of the situations we've faced in the field. I laughed, but there was tension in it. "That's exactly why I need you there. You're the only person who sees me for who I actually am, not who they think I should be." What I didn't know was that Marcus had spent the previous week receiving briefings from federal contacts about threats to my safety that extended beyond the criminal networks I was investigating. The success of my work had apparently made me a target for retaliation, and the FBI had been conducting background checks on everyone in my personal circle as part of their threat assessment. That background investigation had uncovered information about my family that would soon change everything. The Johnson family Easter brunch was a tradition that went back to my childhood, held every year in my parents' formal dining room with its polished mahogany table, fine china, and carefully arranged floral centerpieces. The guest list was always the same: my parents, Emma and David, Jake and Lauren, and whatever partner I happened to be dating at the time, though my relationships rarely lasted long enough to survive multiple family gatherings. This year felt different because of Marcus's presence. Unlike my previous boyfriends, who had been intimidated by my family's wealth and status, Marcus carried himself with quiet confidence. His military bearing and obvious competence seemed to earn a grudging respect from my father, while his polite deference to my mother temporarily softened her usual criticism of my lifestyle choices. The conversation flowed through familiar territory: Emma's latest surgical innovations, David's recent partnership track promotion, Jake's expanding client base, and Lauren's elaborate wedding plan. As always, I listened to these updates with a mixture of genuine pride in my siblings' accomplishments and resentment at how easily their achievements were celebrated while mine were dismissed or ignored. When the conversation naturally turned to my life, I saw an opening to share my exciting news. Taking a deep breath, I announced that my trafficking documentary had been accepted into Sundance, and that I was being considered for a Peabody Award. Instead of the congratulations I had hoped for, my announcement was met with uncomfortable silence. My mother was the first to respond, setting down her mimosa glass with deliberate precision. "Sarah, honey, while I'm sure that's very nice for you personally, your so-called career continues to be a source of concern for this family. You're investigating dangerous criminals, you require a bodyguard to stay safe, and frankly, the publicity around your work reflects poorly on all of us." The criticism stung, but it wasn't unexpected. What surprised me was the vehemence in her voice, as if my success was somehow threatening rather than merely embarrassing. "Mom," I said, trying to keep my voice level, "this documentary could help rescue dozens of trafficking victims. The Peabody Award would recognize the impact of this work on a national level. These aren't just personal achievements, they're contributing to solving serious crimes." "That's exactly the problem," my father interjected, his face reddening slightly. "Why can't you focus on positive stories? Success stories? Why does everything you touch have to involve criminals and controversy?" Jake leaned forward, his tone condescending in the way that had irritated me since childhood. "Sarah, I think what Dad is trying to say is that your work brings unwanted attention to our family. My clients read the news. When they see our last name associated with human trafficking investigations, even as a journalist, it raises questions about our judgment and associations." Emma nodded in agreement, though her expression was more sympathetic than Jake. "We worry about your safety, obviously, but we also worry about how your career choices affect all of us. David's firm represents several international companies, and any association with organized crime investigations, even tangentially, could impact his advancement." The familiar feeling of being ganged up on began to wash over me, but this time something felt different. There was an urgency to their criticism, an edge that went beyond their usual concerns about respectability and family image. They weren't just embarrassed by my work, they seemed genuinely frightened by it. That's when Marcus leaned close to my ear, his voice barely audible above the family conversation that continued around us. What he whispered would change not just that Easter brunch, but my entire understanding of my family and my place within it. "Your brother's been laundering money through his financial practice," Marcus said quietly, his military training allowing him to speak without moving his lips noticeably. "Your sister." Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. This hospital is under federal investigation for Medicare fraud. Your father's insurance company has been systematically denying legitimate claims to boost profit. They're all about to be exposed, and they know your investigative work could eventually lead you to discover their criminal activities. I turned to look at him, searching his face for any indication that this was some kind of joke or mistake. Marcus's expression was deadly serious, his dark eyes conveying both certainty and sympathy for what this revelation meant. "How do you know this?" I whispered back, my mind reeling as I tried to process what he was telling me. "Federal task force briefing yesterday," he replied quietly. "Your trafficking investigation made some powerful enemies, and they've been conducting background checks on everyone connected to you as part of threat assessment. That investigation uncovered your family's activity. The agents wanted me to know because they're concerned about retaliation attempts through family members." Marcus discreetly pulled out his phone beneath the table, angling the screen so only I could see it. The display showed official federal case numbers, investigation timelines, and documentation that made my blood run cold. Jake's financial advisory practice was being monitored for suspicious cash transactions that didn't align with his reported client demographics or typical investment pattern. The amounts were staggering, millions of dollars flowing through accounts that should have been handling middle-class retirement planning and college savings funds. "Look at this," Marcus whispered, scrolling to another screen. "Your brother's been accepting cash deposits from shell companies, linked to construction firms that are known fronts for organized crime. The money gets invested in legitimate portfolios, then withdrawn as investment gains. After a few months, classic laundering operation. The evidence was laid out in stark detail. Transaction records showing Jake's firm receiving payments from companies that existed only on paper, investment reports that documented impossibly consistent returns, and bank routing information that traced back to accounts in the Cayman Islands. My brother, who had always prided himself on his ethical business practices and conservative investment strategies, was apparently running one of the most sophisticated money laundering operations in Connecticut. The federal agents estimate he's processed over $20 million in dirty money over the past 3 years, Marcus continued, his voice so low I had to strain to hear him. They've been building this case for 8 months, waiting for the right moment to move. As Marcus scrolled through more documents, I saw Emma's name appear in a different file. My sister, the dedicated pediatric surgeon who had always claimed her only motivation was helping children, was apparently involved in a Medicare fraud scheme that had bilked the government out of millions of dollars. The hospital where Emma works has been performing unnecessary procedures on elderly patients and billing Medicare for premium services that were never actually provided, Marcus explained, showing me a detailed breakdown of fraudulent claims. Emma's department alone submitted over $4 million in false claims last year. She's not just a participant, she's one of the ringleaders. The documentation showed that Emma had been deliberately scheduling patients for expensive diagnostic procedures that weren't medically necessary, then billing Medicare for both the procedures and extended recovery treatments that never occurred. She had also been collaborating with pharmaceutical companies to prescribe medications that patients didn't need, collecting kickbacks for each prescription while the government covered the inflated cost. They've got her on recorded phone calls discussing how to maximize billing for each patient, Marcus said, scrolling through transcripts that made me feel sick to my stomach. She's been coaching other doctors on how to justify unnecessary procedures to avoid detection. But the worst revelation was yet to come. As Marcus showed me the file on my father's insurance company, I realized that the pattern of criminal behavior in my family went back even further than I had imagined. Your father's company has been systematically denying legitimate claims from cancer patients, elderly clients, and families with disabled children, Marcus revealed, his voice heavy with disgust. They've developed algorithms designed to automatically reject claims that should be approved, knowing that most people won't have the resources or energy to fight the denials. The evidence against my father was particularly damning because it showed deliberate, calculated cruelty. Internal company emails discussed strategies for delaying claim processing until patients died, eliminating the need to pay out life insurance benefits. Training manuals instructed claims adjusters to look for technicalities that could void policies, even when those technicalities were irrelevant to the actual claims being filed. The State Insurance Commission has been investigating him for 2 years, Marcus continued. They have whistleblower testimony from former employees who were fired for trying to process legitimate claims. One adjuster came forward with evidence that your father personally approved a policy to deny cancer treatment coverage for children, knowing it would result in deaths that could have been prevented. As I absorbed this information, the conversation at the Easter table continued around me, but now every word took on a different meaning. When Jake mentioned his expanding client base, I heard it as evidence of his growing money laundering operation. When Emma discussed her department's impressive productivity numbers, I understood them as metrics of fraud rather than medical excellence. When my father talked about his company's profitability, I recognized it as blood money extracted from desperate families during their most vulnerable moment. The realization that my entire family was involved in criminal activities was devastating enough, but Marcus wasn't finished with his revelations. There's more, he said, scrolling to a new section of file. They know about your trafficking investigation, and they're terrified that your methodology and contacts could eventually lead you to discover their activities. Your brother's money laundering connects to some of the same criminal networks you've been investigating. Your sister's Medicare fraud involves pharmaceutical companies that have been linked to human trafficking for organ harvesting. Your father's insurance company has been used to launder money for several of the shell corporations you've been tracking. The scope of their criminal involvement was breathtaking. My family wasn't just engaged in separate white-collar crimes, they were interconnected parts of a larger criminal enterprise that overlapped significantly with the trafficking networks I had been investigating for the past year and a half. The federal task force believes that your family has been trying to discredit you and undermine your work because they're afraid you'll eventually uncover evidence that implicates them directly, Marcus explained. Every time they call you unstable, irresponsible, or embarrassing, they're trying to establish a record that could be used to question your credibility if you ever discovered their activities. Suddenly, years of family interactions took on a sinister new context. The constant criticism of my career choices wasn't just about social embarrassment or family expectations. It was a deliberate campaign to undermine my professional reputation before I could become a threat to their criminal enterprise. The dismissive comments about my work being dangerous and controversial weren't expressions of concern for my safety. They were attempts to discourage me from pursuing the kind of investigations that might eventually expose their own illegal activities. When do the arrests happen? I asked Marcus, struggling to keep my voice steady as the full implications of what he was telling me sank in. Soon, he replied. The task force has been waiting for your trafficking documentary to be completed and submitted to festivals before moving, because they don't want the arrests to interfere with your work or compromise your safety. But now that Sundance has accepted your film, they're planning coordinated raids within the next few weeks. As Marcus put his phone away, I looked around the Easter table with completely different eyes. My sister Emma, who was currently discussing the challenges of pediatric surgery with our family friends, had been systematically defrauding the government while putting children at risk with unnecessary medical procedures. My brother Jake, who was explaining investment strategies to David with apparent expertise and integrity, had been laundering money for organized crime syndicates. My father Robert, who was telling stories about helping families protect their financial futures through insurance, had been denying coverage to dying children to boost his company's profit. The perfect family Easter brunch suddenly looked like a gathering of sophisticated criminals who had been using their respectable careers as cover for years of illegal activity. More disturbing still was the realization that their treatment of me over the years had been motivated, not by disappointment or concern, but by fear that I might eventually discover and expose their crimes. Sarah, you look pale, my mother Linda said, noticing my expression. Are you feeling all right? You've been very quiet. I studied my mother's face, searching for signs of knowledge or involvement in the criminal activities that apparently permeated our family. While Marcus hadn't mentioned specific charges against her, it seemed impossible that she could be completely unaware of what her husband and children were doing. I'm fine, Mom, I replied, though my voice sounded hollow even to my own ears. Just thinking about work. Always thinking about work, Jake said with a laugh that now sounded forced and nervous. You know, Sarah, maybe it's time to consider transitioning to something more stable. I've been talking to some colleagues who might be able to help you find a position in corporate communications or public relations. Something that uses your storytelling skills but doesn't involve all the danger and controversy. The offer, which I might have interpreted as genuine concern just minutes earlier, now sounded like an attempt to co-opt my skills for potentially criminal purposes. I wondered how many of Jake's colleagues were part of the money laundering network he was apparently operating. That's very thoughtful, I said carefully, but I'm committed to the work I'm doing, especially now that it's getting recognition at places like Sundance. Recognition doesn't pay the bills, my father interjected, though his tone was sharper than the comment warranted, and it certainly doesn't provide the kind of security and stability that a family needs. Emma leaned forward, her expression serious. Dad's right, Sarah. David and I have been talking, and we think you should consider whether this career path is really sustainable long-term. The stress, the danger, the constant travel, it's not healthy. Plus the impact on family relationships, Lauren added, though she immediately looked like she regretted speaking. I mean, we all worry about you. The coordinated nature of their comments was becoming obvious. This wasn't a spontaneous expression of family concern, it was a planned intervention designed to pressure me into abandoning my investigative work. The timing, coming just as I had achieved major career milestones, suggested that they were increasingly desperate to neutralize what they perceived as a threat to their criminal activities. Marcus caught my eye and gave an almost imperceptible nod, confirming that he was also picking up on the orchestrated nature of their comment. His military training had taught him to recognize coordinated deception, and it was clear that my family was executing some kind of predetermined strategy to undermine my confidence and redirect my career. You know what's interesting, I said, deciding to test their reactions. My trafficking investigation has revealed some fascinating connections between legitimate businesses and criminal enterprises. It's amazing how money laundering operations can hide behind respectable financial services, how healthcare fraud can be disguised as quality patient care, how insurance companies can be used to facilitate organized crime. The reaction around the table was immediate and telling. Jake's face went pale, and he began fidgeting with his napkin. Emma's smile became frozen and artificial. My father's jaw tightened visibly, and he reached for his wine glass with a hand that was clearly shaking. That sounds very complex, my mother said, her voice carefully neutral. I'm sure those kinds of investigations require tremendous expertise and resources. They do, I agreed, watching their faces carefully. But the federal task forces I work with have incredible capability. They can trace financial transactions, analyze communication patterns, identify connections between seemingly unrelated criminal activities. It's really quite impressive what they can uncover when they focus on a particular geographic area or set of businesses. David cleared his throat uncomfortably. Sarah, maybe we should change the subject. This kind of talk about criminal investigations isn't really appropriate for Easter brunch. Why not? I asked innocently. I'm proud of the work I'm doing. These investigations help protect vulnerable people and hold criminals accountable for their actions. Shouldn't we be celebrating the fact that law enforcement is cracking down on fraud and corruption? Of course, Jake said quickly, though his voice was tight with tension. It's just that some of us prefer to keep work talk separate from family time. The irony of his comment was almost overwhelming. My family had spent years making my work the central topic of conversation at every gathering, criticizing my career choices and questioning my judgment. Now suddenly, they wanted to avoid discussing my professional achievements because those achievements posed a direct threat to their criminal enterprises. Marcus leaned back in his chair, his posture relaxed, but his eyes alert as he observed the family dynamics playing out around the table. I could see him mentally cataloging their reactions, noting the tells and behavioral changes that confirmed what the federal investigation had already revealed about their guilt. Actually, Marcus said, speaking for the first time since we had arrived, I find Sarah's work fascinating. The level of sophistication in modern criminal enterprises is remarkable. Just last week she was explaining to me how organized crime syndicates use legitimate businesses to launder money, often targeting professional services, like financial planning, healthcare, and insurance because those industries handle large cash flows and complex transactions that are harder to monitor. The effect of Marcus's comment was electric. Emma dropped her fork, creating a loud clatter against her plate. Jake's face flushed red, and he began stammering something about needing to check his phone for messages from clients. My father stood up abruptly, claiming he needed to take a business call, though it was Easter Sunday, and his office would be closed. Marcus has been incredibly supportive of my work, I continued, enjoying the obvious discomfort my family was experiencing. He's helped me understand how criminal investigations work from the law enforcement perspective. It's given me new insights into how these operations are detected and prosecuted. I'm sure that's very educational, my mother said, though her voice was strained. Perhaps we should move to the living room for coffee and dessert. As we relocated to the adjacent room, I noticed that my family members were having whispered conversations with their partners, their body language betraying anxiety and urgency. Jake was furiously texting on his phone while Lauren looked increasingly confused and concerned. Emma was having what appeared to be a heated discussion with David, who kept glancing in my direction with obvious worry. The living room, which had always been a showcase of my parents' success and good taste, now felt like a stage set for criminals trying to maintain their cover. The expensive furnishings, family portraits, and carefully arranged flowers seemed like props in an elaborate deception that was finally beginning to unravel. Marcus positioned himself near the window, a tactical choice that gave him a clear view of both the room and the driveway outside. I realized he was probably anticipating the possibility that my family might attempt to prevent us from leaving once they fully understood how much we knew about their criminal activities. "Sarah," my father said as he returned from his supposed business call, his voice carrying a forced joviality, "I've been thinking about our conversation earlier. Maybe there are some ways the family could support your work more directly. Jake has connections in the financial industry that might be helpful for funding your documentaries. Emma knows people in healthcare who might be willing to share their stories. We could all be more involved in helping you succeed." The offer was so transparent in its desperation that I almost laughed. After years of discouraging my work and undermining my confidence, they were suddenly eager to become collaborators. The only explanation was that they hoped to gain some level of control over my investigations, or at least advance warning about what I might discover. "That's very generous, Dad," I replied, "but I've found that maintaining independence is crucial for investigative work. Any appearance of conflict of interest or family influence could compromise the integrity of my reporting. But surely family support is different from outside interference," Emma said, her voice pleading. "We're not trying to influence your work. We just want to help you succeed." "The best way you can help me succeed," I said, looking directly at each of them, "is to continue being honest, law-abiding citizens who give me no reason to be concerned about conflicts of interest in my reporting." The silence that followed this comment was deafening. Everyone in the room understood the implicit challenge in my words, though they couldn't be certain how much I actually knew about their criminal activities. Marcus stepped forward slightly, a subtle movement that nonetheless conveyed his readiness to protect me if the situation escalated. His presence had clearly been noted by my family, who were probably wondering why an investigative journalist would need a bodyguard with obvious military training, unless she was working on something particularly dangerous and sensitive. "Well," my mother said finally, her voice artificially bright, "this has been a lovely Easter celebration, but I'm sure everyone has other commitments this afternoon." The dismissal was premature and awkward, given that we had only been there for 2 hours, and Easter brunch typically lasted most of the day. But it was clear that my family could no longer maintain their facade of normalcy now that they suspected I might know about their criminal activity. As we prepared to leave, I hugged each family member goodbye, studying their faces, and trying to reconcile the people I had known all my life with the criminals they had apparently become. Emma's embrace felt desperate, as if she was trying to convey some kind of message or appeal. Jake's handshake was perfunctory and cold, his eyes avoiding mine entirely. My parents' farewells were stiff and formal, lacking any of the warmth that had characterized our relationship despite our disagreements about my career. Walking to the car with Marcus, I felt like I was leaving behind not just my childhood home, but my entire understanding of who my family was and what they represented. The revelation of their criminal activities had shattered my perception of them as merely conservative, image-conscious people who disapproved of my unconventional choices. Instead, they were sophisticated criminals who had spent years trying to undermine my work because they feared I might eventually expose their illegal enterprises. "How are you holding up?" Marcus asked as we drove away from the house where I had spent my childhood, the familiar streets now feeling foreign and threatening. "I honestly don't know," I replied, watching my parents' house disappear in the side mirror. Everything I thought I knew about my family was apparently a lie. The criticism, the disappointment, the constant pressure to change careers, it was all about protecting their criminal activities, not about concern for my well-being or family reputation. Marcus nodded grimly. "It's going to get worse before it gets better. When those federal raids happen, the media attention will be intense. Your family will probably try to claim they were trying to protect you from getting involved, or that they were attempting to shield you from the controversy. They'll spin their behavior as concern rather than self-preservation." "What am I supposed to do with this information?" I asked, feeling overwhelmed by the implications of what I had learned. "Do I confront them? Do I try to warn them? Do I pretend I don't know anything and wait for the arrest to happen? That depends on what kind of person you want to be, Marcus replied thoughtfully, and what kind of relationship, if any, you want to have with your family after this is all over. The drive back to my apartment in Hartford felt like traveling through a completely different world than the one I had inhabited just hours earlier. Every familiar landmark along the route seemed to mock the naive person I had been that morning. The woman who had dressed carefully for Easter brunch and hoped for family approval that I now understood was never really about approval at all. It had been about control, manipulation, and Marcus remained quiet for most of the drive, allowing me space to process what I had learned while staying alert to our surroundings. His training had taught him that revelations like this often triggered desperate responses from the people being exposed, and he wasn't taking any chances with my safety. I noticed him checking the rearview mirror more frequently than usual and taking a route that included several unexpected turns, likely to ensure we weren't being followed. When we finally reached my building, Marcus insisted on conducting a security sweep of my apartment before allowing me to enter, while he checked windows, examined locks, and ensured that no one had been inside during our absence. I stood in my living room feeling like a stranger in my own space. The family photos on my bookshelf seemed to stare back at me accusingly, their smiling faces now revealed as masks worn by people I apparently had never really known. All clear, Marcus announced, but his expression remained serious. We need to talk about next steps because this situation is about to become a lot more complicated. I sank into my couch, suddenly feeling exhausted despite the early hour. The emotional weight of discovering that my entire family was engaged in criminal activity was beginning to settle in, along with the realization that my world was about to change in ways I couldn't fully anticipate. The federal task force is going to want to debrief you, Marcus continued, taking a seat across from me. They'll need to know about any conversations you've had with family members that might be relevant to their investigations, any observations you've made about their behavior or business practices, and any information you might have that could help build their cases. The prospect of being interviewed by federal agents about my own family felt surreal and terrifying. Am I considered a suspect in any of this? I asked, though I wasn't sure I wanted to hear the answer. No, Marcus replied firmly. Your background check came back completely clean, and your work as an investigative journalist actually supports your credibility as a witness, but they'll need to be thorough in documenting that you had no knowledge of or involvement in your family's criminal activity. I thought about all the family gatherings over the years, all the conversations about business and career success that I had listened to with a mixture of boredom and resentment. Had there been signs that I missed, clues that might have revealed what was really happening behind the facade of respectability and achievement? I feel like I should have known, I said, more to myself than to Mark. All those years of them criticizing my work, trying to get me to change careers, acting like my success was somehow threatening to the family. How did I not see what was really happening? Marcus leaned forward, his expression compassionate but serious. You couldn't have known because they were professionals at deception. Your brother has been laundering money for 3 years without detection by financial regulators. Your sister has been committing Medicare fraud for even longer while maintaining an excellent reputation in the medical community. Your father built his insurance empire by systematically defrauding clients while appearing to be a pillar of the business community. These aren't amateur criminals who make obvious mistakes. His words provided some comfort, but I still felt a deep sense of betrayal that went beyond the criminal activities themselves. The people I had loved and looked up to, despite our disagreements, had been living double lives that made my own work investigating criminal enterprises seem almost naive by comparison. There's something else you need to know, Marcus said, his tone becoming even more serious. The federal investigation didn't start with your family. It started with the criminal networks you've been investigating for your trafficking documentary. Your family's activities came to light because they're connected to the same organized crime syndicates that have been exploiting victims along the I-95 corridor. This revelation hit me like a physical blow. Not only was my family involved in criminal activity, but their crimes were directly connected to the human trafficking networks that I had been working to expose. The victims I had interviewed, the stories I had documented, the suffering I had witnessed. My own family had been profiting from systems that enabled and perpetuated that exploitation. How directly connected? I asked, though I dreaded the answer. Marcus pulled out his secure phone and showed me a complex organizational chart that mapped relationships between various criminal enterprises. Your brother's money laundering operation has been cleaning funds for several construction companies that use trafficked labor. The pharmaceutical companies involved in your sister's Medicare fraud scheme have been linked to organ trafficking networks. Your father's insurance company has been providing coverage for shell corporations that facilitate both money laundering and human trafficking operations. The scope of their involvement was staggering. This wasn't just white-collar crime committed by professionals who had lost their moral compass. This was active participation in criminal enterprises that directly harmed the most vulnerable people in society. My family had been profiting from the same systems of exploitation that I had dedicated my career to fighting against. The federal agents believe that your family became aware of your trafficking investigation early in the process. Probably through their criminal contacts who recognized your name and made the connection. Marcus continued. That's when they began their campaign to discredit your work and push you toward a different career path. They weren't just protecting themselves. They were protecting an entire criminal network that generates hundreds of millions of dollars annually. I thought back to the timing of when my family's criticism of my work had intensified, trying to correlate it with major developments in my trafficking investigation. The pattern was clear once I knew what to look for. Every time I had made a breakthrough in identifying key players or uncovering new aspects of the trafficking networks, my family had escalated their efforts to undermine my confidence and redirect my career. They've been sabotaging me from the beginning, I said, the full implications finally sinking in. Every family gathering where they made me feel like a failure, every conversation where they questioned my judgment, every attempt to get me to abandon investigative journalism, it was all designed to protect their criminal enterprises. Marcus nodded grimly. And it almost worked. If you hadn't been so committed to your work, if you hadn't had the support of your editors and the federal task force, they might have succeeded in neutralizing you as a threat. The realization that my own family had been working against me for years was devastating. But it also clarified something that had always puzzled me about our relationship. I had never understood why people who claimed to love me seemed so determined to prevent me from pursuing work that gave my life meaning and purpose. Now I understood that it hadn't been about love or concern at all. It had been about criminal self-preservation disguised as family dysfunction. What happens now? I asked, feeling overwhelmed by the complexity of the situation I found myself in. Now you have some difficult decisions to make, Marcus replied. The federal agents will want to know if you're willing to cooperate with their investigation by providing information about your family's behavior and possibly participating in controlled encounters that could help them gather additional evidence. The idea of wearing a wire or secretly recording conversations with my family members felt like a betrayal, even though I now knew they had been betraying me for years. You mean become an informant against my own family? I mean help law enforcement build cases against criminals who happen to be related to you, Marcus corrected gently. These aren't parking tickets or tax evasion charges. Your brother has helped launder money that funds human trafficking operations. Your sister has committed fraud that resulted in unnecessary medical procedures being performed on elderly patients. Your father has denied insurance coverage to families with dying children. These are serious crimes with real victims. He was right, of course. But knowing that didn't make the emotional reality any easier to accept. These were people I had shared holidays with. People whose approval I had craved despite our differences. People who had shaped my childhood and influenced the person I had become. Learning that they were criminals didn't immediately erase decades of family bonds, even if those bonds had been based on lies and manipulation. You don't have to decide anything right now, Marcus said, recognizing my internal struggle. But you should know that the federal raids are going to happen within the next 2 weeks, regardless of whether you cooperate or not. The evidence they've gathered is sufficient for arrests and indictment. Your cooperation could help ensure that all the participants are identified and prosecuted, but it's not essential for the basic cases against your immediate family members. The timeline shocked me. 2 weeks meant that by the end of April, my family would be in federal custody facing charges that could result in decades in prison. The comfortable suburban life they had built, the respected positions they held in the community, the social status they had worked so hard to maintain, all of it would be destroyed when their criminal activities became public knowledge. Will there be media coverage? I asked, though I already knew the answer. Extensive coverage, Marcus confirmed. Money laundering, Medicare fraud, and insurance fraud involving millions of dollars, all connected to organized crime networks that facilitate human trafficking. This story will dominate local news for weeks and probably get national attention because of the trafficking connections. I thought about my colleagues in the journalism community, many of whom would undoubtedly be assigned to cover the story. The irony of investigative journalists reporting on the arrest of family members of one of their own would not be lost on anyone in the industry. My professional reputation, which my family had spent years trying to undermine, would inevitably be affected by association with their criminal activities. How do I protect my work? I asked, suddenly panicking about the potential impact on my trafficking documentary and the victims whose stories I had been trusted to tell. That's actually one of the reasons the federal task force has been coordinating with you, Marcus explained. They want to ensure that your documentary can be completed and released before the arrests happen, so that the important work you've been doing isn't overshadowed by the family's scandal. Sundance has already accepted your film, which provides some protection for your professional reputation, but you'll need to be prepared for questions about whether your family connections influenced your reporting. The unfairness of having my professional integrity questioned because of crimes I had no knowledge of was infuriating, but I understood the necessity of addressing these concerns proactively. What kind of question? Whether you had access to information about criminal activities that gave you advantages in your investigation. Whether your family's connections to organized crime provided you with sources or insights that other journalists wouldn't have had. Whether there were conflicts of interest that should have been disclosed in your reporting. Each potential question felt like another layer of injustice. Not only had my family been working to sabotage my career, but their criminal activities would now raise questions about the legitimacy of work I had accomplished entirely through my own efforts and ethical reporting practices. The good news is that the federal investigation will actually support your credibility, Marcus continued. The agents have documented that you had no knowledge of your family's criminal activities, and that your investigative work was conducted independently using legitimate sources and methods. In fact, your reporting helped them identify some connections they hadn't previously discovered. This was a small comfort, but it didn't address the broader challenge of how to move forward professionally and personally once my family's crimes became public knowledge. How am I supposed to face my colleagues, my sources, the victims I've interviewed who trusted me to tell their stories, the same way you've faced every other challenge in your career? Marcus replied, with integrity, professionalism, and commitment to the truth. Your family's crimes don't change the quality of your work or the importance of the stories you've told. If anything, discovering that you've been fighting against criminal networks that included your own family members demonstrates your independence and ethical commitment. His words were logical and supportive, but the emotional reality of the situation was still overwhelming. I thought about the victims I had interviewed for my trafficking documentary, people who had trusted me with their most traumatic experiences. How would they feel when they learned that my family had been profiting from the same criminal enterprises that had exploited them? I need to call my editor, I said suddenly, realizing that I had professional obligations that couldn't be delayed while I processed the personal implications of what I had learned. Before you do that, Marcus said, you should know that your editor has already been briefed by the federal task force. The documentary project has been under protection as part of the investigation, which means your news organization has been cooperating with law enforcement to ensure that your work isn't compromised by the family scandal. The revelation that my professional life had been under federal oversight without my knowledge was jarring, even though I understood the necessity of such measures. So everyone knew about this except me? Not everyone, and not about everything, Marcus clarified. Your editor knew that there were security concerns related to your family, but not the specific details of their criminal activity. The federal agents wanted to protect both your safety and the integrity of your investigation by limiting the number of people who had access to complete information. I felt manipulated and controlled, even though the manipulation had apparently been designed to protect me rather than harm me. The realization that major decisions about my life and career had been made without my knowledge or consent was difficult to accept, regardless of the good intentions behind those decisions. I need some time to think about all of this, I said, standing up and walking to the window that overlooked Hartford's downtown skyline. The city looked the same as it had that morning, but I felt like I was seeing it from the perspective of a completely different person. Marcus joined me at the window, his presence reassuring despite the chaos of emotions I was experiencing. Take all the time you need, but remember that the clock is ticking. Once those federal raids happen, your options for how to handle this situation will become much more limited. The weight of the decisions I needed to make was enormous. I could cooperate with the federal investigation and potentially help ensure that all participants in the criminal enterprises were brought to justice, but doing so would require me to actively participate in the destruction of my family's life. I could remain silent and let events unfold without my involvement, but that would mean potentially allowing some criminals to escape prosecution or receive lighter sentences than they deserved. There's one more thing you should consider, Marcus said quietly. Your family knows that you're getting close to exposing criminal networks that they're connected to. They also know that you have federal contacts and access to investigative resources that could threaten their operation. Even if you decide not to cooperate with the investigation, they may not trust that you'll remain silent about what you might discover. The implication of his words was chilling. You think they might try to stop me from continuing my work? I think they're already panicking, and panicked criminals make unpredictable decisions, Marcus replied. That's why I'm going to be staying close to you until this situation is resolved. The federal task force has assessed you as being at elevated risk for retaliation attempts. The idea that my own family might pose a physical threat to me was almost impossible to process. These were people who had changed my diapers, taught me to ride a bicycle, and attended my college graduation. The notion that they might now see me as an enemy to be eliminated was so foreign to my understanding of family relationships that I couldn't fully accept it as a possibility. But Marcus's military training and experience with criminal behavior gave him insights that my optimistic assumptions about family loyalty couldn't match. If my family members were sophisticated enough to maintain criminal enterprises for years while appearing to be respectable professionals, they were certainly capable of making calculated decisions about eliminating threats to their freedom and financial security. What kind of retaliation are you concerned about? I asked, though I wasn't sure I wanted to hear the answer. Anything from character assassination designed to destroy your professional credibility, to more direct attempts to prevent you from continuing your investigative work, Marcus replied. They've already spent years trying to undermine your career through psychological manipulation. Now that those efforts have failed and their criminal activities are about to be exposed, they may escalate to more aggressive tactics. The conversation was interrupted by the sound of my phone ringing. The caller ID showed my sister Emma's name, and I looked at Marcus questioningly. Answer it, he said, but be careful about what you say. They may be trying to gauge how much you know, or attempt to manipulate you into making commitments that could complicate the federal investigation. I accepted the call, putting it on speaker so Marcus could monitor the conversation. Emma's voice sounded strained and artificial, lacking the natural warmth that usually characterized our interactions. Sarah, I wanted to follow up on our conversation at brunch today. I've been thinking about what you said about your work and I realized that I haven't been as supportive as I should have been. The sudden change in tone from criticism to support was so dramatic that it confirmed Marcus's suspicions about my family's motivation. Emma was clearly following some kind of script designed to repair our relationship and potentially gather information about my knowledge of their criminal activities. I appreciate that, Emma, I replied carefully. It means a lot to hear you say that. I was wondering if you might be free for lunch this week, Emma continued. I'd love to hear more about your documentary project and maybe learn about ways that David and I could support your work. We have some connections in the healthcare industry that might be helpful for future investigations. The offer was exactly what Marcus had predicted, an attempt to position themselves as allies while potentially gaining access to information about my investigative methods and sources. That sounds lovely, but my schedule is pretty intense right now with the Sundance preparations and follow-up interviews. Of course I understand, but Sarah, I also wanted to say that I'm concerned about some of the people you've been working with. Investigative journalism can attract individuals who don't have your best interests at heart, and I worry that you might be trusting people who could eventually betray your confidence or use your work for their own purposes. The irony of receiving warnings about betrayal from someone who had been betraying me for years was almost overwhelming, but I managed to keep my voice neutral. I'm very careful about who I trust, Emma. My safety protocols are quite thorough, I'm sure they are, but family is different. We're the people who will always have your back regardless of what happens with your career or your other relationships. I hope you know that you can always count on us if you need help or support. The manipulation was so transparent that it would have been laughable if the stakes weren't so serious. Emma was attempting to position the family as my primary support system while simultaneously undermining my confidence in the professional relationships that had made my career possible. I do appreciate knowing that, I said, though the words felt hollow. I should probably get going though. I have some deadline work to finish this evening. Of course, but Sarah, please promise me that you'll call if you need anything, and please be careful about who you trust. I love you and I want to make sure you're safe. After ending the call, I looked at Marcus with a mixture of amazement and disgust. She's actually trying to get me to distrust you and the federal agents while positioning herself as the person I should rely on for support. Classic manipulation technique, Marcus confirmed. Create doubt about legitimate support systems while offering yourself as the alternative. If she could convince you to confide in family instead of law enforcement, they could stay ahead of the investigation and potentially identify ways to minimize their legal exposure. The sophistication of their deception was becoming more apparent with each interaction. These weren't people who had stumbled into criminal activity through poor judgment or desperate circumstances. They were calculating individuals who had built their entire adult lives around maintaining criminal enterprises while appearing to be respectable members of society. I can't do this, I said suddenly, feeling overwhelmed by the complexity of the situation and the emotional burden of having to treat my family as potential threats. I can't pretend to have normal conversations with people who have been lying to me for years while planning how to protect myself from them. Marcus moved closer, his expression understanding but firm. You don't have to do this alone, and you don't have to make all the decisions right now. But you do need to recognize that your safety and your professional future depend on how you handle the next few weeks. Your family isn't going to give up easily, and the federal investigation is going to move forward regardless of your comfort level. His words reminded me that this situation was bigger than my personal feelings or family relationships. Real victims were depending on the successful prosecution of the criminal networks I had been investigating. Justice required that all participants in these enterprises be held accountable for their actions, regardless of their family connections or social status. What do the federal agents need from me? I asked, resigned to the reality that I couldn't remain neutral in a situation where neutrality would effectively protect criminals at the expense of their victims. They want to meet with you tomorrow morning to discuss your potential cooperation with the investigation, Marcus replied. You'll have legal representation provided, and you won't be required to make any commitments during the initial meeting. They just want to explain your options and answer any questions you might have about the process. The prospect of sitting in a federal building discussing my family's criminal activities with law enforcement agents felt surreal, but I understood that it was a necessary step toward resolving a situation that was already beyond my control. Will you be there? I asked, suddenly feeling very young and vulnerable despite my professional accomplishments and public recognition. I'll be there, Marcus confirmed. And so will representatives from your news organization and legal counsel provided by the federal task force. You won't be navigating this situation without support. As evening settled over Hartford, I tried to prepare myself mentally for what would undoubtedly be the most difficult conversation of my professional and personal life. The family I had known and loved, despite our complicated relationships, was about to be revealed as an elaborate fiction. The real people behind those familiar faces were criminals whose illegal activities had contributed to the exploitation and suffering of vulnerable people around the world. The woman who had woken up that Easter morning hoping for family approval and recognition was gone forever, replaced by someone who would have to decide whether to help prosecute her own family members for crimes that struck at the heart of everything she believed in fighting against. The federal building in downtown Hartford felt imposing and sterile as Marcus and I approached the security checkpoint the following morning. I had barely slept, spending most of the night alternating between rage at my family's deception and grief for the relationships I had thought were real. The professional clothing I had chosen felt like armor, a reminder that I was entering this meeting as an accomplished journalist rather than simply as a victim of family manipulation. Special Agent Rebecca Chen met us in the lobby, her demeanor professional but warm. She was younger than I had expected, probably in her early 30s, with an intelligence in her eyes that immediately commanded respect. As we rode the elevator to the 14th floor, she explained that the meeting would include representatives from the FBI, the Securities and Exchange Commission, the Department of Health and Human Services, and the State Insurance Commission. "We understand this is an incredibly difficult situation for you personally," Agent Chen said, as we walked down a corridor lined with official portraits and government seal. "Our goal today is to provide you with complete information about the investigations and explain how your cooperation could help us ensure that all participants in these criminal enterprises face appropriate consequences." The conference room was larger than I had anticipated, with a polished mahogany table surrounded by leather chairs and walls lined with law books and federal regulations. 6 people were already seated around the table, each with thick folders of documents and laptop computers displaying what I assumed were case files related to my family's activities. Agent Chen made introductions around the table, but the names and titles blurred together in my nervousness. What struck me most was how seriously these federal investigators were taking crimes that my family had apparently been committing while maintaining their respected positions in Connecticut's professional community. "Johnson," began Agent David Foster from the SEC, "we want to start by assuring you that you are not a target of any of these investigations. Our background check confirmed that you had no knowledge of or involvement in any of the criminal activities we'll be discussing today. You're here as a potential witness and co-operator, not as a suspect." The relief I felt at this confirmation was overwhelming, though Marcus had already assured me that I wasn't considered a criminal participant. Hearing it officially from federal investigators made the reality of my innocence feel more concrete. "However," continued Agent Foster, "we do need to understand the extent of your interactions with family members regarding their business activity, and we'd like to discuss whether you'd be willing to assist our investigation by participating in controlled encounters that could help us gather additional evidence." Agent Chen opened one of the thick folders and began laying out photographs and documents that mapped the criminal enterprises my family had been operating. The scope of their activities was even more extensive than Marcus had initially revealed to me during our conversation at Easter brunch. "Your brother Jake's money laundering operation processed approximately $47 million in illegal funds over the past 4 years," Agent Chen explained, pointing to financial records that showed complex patterns of deposits, investments, and withdrawal. "The money came from construction companies that used trafficked labor, drug distribution networks operating along the I-95 corridor, and human trafficking organizations that moved victims between New York and Boston." She slid a photograph across the table showing Jake at what appeared to be a business meeting with several men I didn't recognize. "This photograph was taken 6 months ago at a restaurant in Stanford. Your brother is meeting with Miguel Santos, who runs a construction company that's been using undocumented workers in conditions that constitute human trafficking, and David Park, who manages financial operations for a drug distribution network." The image of my brother casually sharing a meal with people who exploited vulnerable human beings was nauseating. Jake had always presented himself as an ethical financial professional who carefully vetted his clients and maintained the highest standards of integrity in his practice. The construction company alone has been responsible for trafficking over 200 workers from Central America over the past 3 years. Agent Chen continued, "These workers had their passports confiscated, were housed in substandard conditions, and were forced to work without proper compensation or legal protections. Your brother's money laundering allowed this operation to appear legitimate to banking regulators and law enforcement agents." Agent Sandra Williams from Health and Human Services took over the presentation, focusing on Emma's Medicare fraud activities. "Your sister's scheme was particularly sophisticated because it involved multiple layers of deception within the healthcare system. She wasn't just billing for unnecessary procedures, she was coordinating with pharmaceutical companies to conduct illegal medical experiments on elderly patients without their informed consent. The revelation that Emma had been experimenting on patients was so horrifying that I had to grip the edge of the table to steady myself. This wasn't just financial fraud, It was a violation of the most fundamental principles of medical ethics and human dignity. The pharmaceutical companies involved in your sister's scheme have connections to organ trafficking networks that operate internationally, Agent Williams continued, showing me photographs of Emma at medical conferences with individuals who were apparently criminal conspirators rather than legitimate colleagues. Patients who died during these unauthorized experiments had their organs harvested and sold through black market networks that your sister helped facilitate through falsified medical records. The documents Agent Williams showed me detailed how Emma had been identifying elderly patients with specific medical conditions that made their organs valuable for transplantation, then conducting experimental procedures that were designed to fail, ensuring that fresh organs would be available for harvesting. The families of these patients had been told that their loved ones died from complications related to their existing medical conditions, never knowing that they had been murdered for their organs. We estimate that your sister's activities resulted in the deaths of at least 37 elderly patients over the past 2 years, Agent Williams said, her voice heavy with the weight of these crimes. The organ trafficking network she facilitated generated over $15 million in revenue, with your sister receiving approximately $2 million in compensation for her participation. The insurance fraud committed by my father was presented by Agent Michael Torres from the State Insurance Commission, and while it didn't involve direct violence like Emma's activities, the systematic cruelty was equally devastating. Your father's company developed algorithms specifically designed to deny legitimate claims from the most vulnerable populations, Agent Torres explained, showing me internal company documents that detailed strategies for avoiding payouts to cancer patients, families with disabled children, elderly clients requiring long-term care. The documents revealed that my father's company had identified demographic groups that were least likely to have the resources or knowledge necessary to fight claim denials, then systematically targeted these populations for rejection regardless of the legitimacy of their claim. We've documented over 3,000 cases where your father's company denied legitimate claims that resulted in preventable deaths or severe hardship for policyholders, Agent Torres continued. In many cases, the company waited until claimants died before processing their requests, allowing them to avoid payouts entirely while keeping the premiums that had been paid for years. One case file Agent Torres showed me involved a 7-year-old girl with leukemia, whose treatment was denied based on a technicality in the policy language, despite the fact the family had been paying premiums for 8 years without any previous claim. The little girl died while her parents exhausted their savings trying to pay for treatment that should have been covered by their insurance policy. Your father personally reviewed and approved the denial of this claim, Agent Torres said, pointing to my father's signature on a document that had essentially sentenced a child to death for the sake of company profit. He knew that denying coverage would likely result in the child's death, but he approved the denial anyway because it protected the company's profit margins. The accumulated weight of learning about my family's crimes was becoming unbearable. These weren't abstract financial violations or victimless white-collar crimes. My family members had been directly responsible for trafficking, murder, torture, and the exploitation of the most vulnerable people in society. Agent Chen returned to the center of the presentation, explaining how all 3 criminal enterprises were connected through shared financial networks and mutual criminal associates. The money your brother laundered funded the trafficking operations that provided victims for the organ harvesting your sister facilitated, Agent Chen explained, using a complex diagram to show the connections between the different criminal activities. Your father's insurance company provided coverage for the shell corporations that all 3 enterprises used to appear legitimate to regulatory authority. The diagram showed dozens of interconnected relationships between my family members and criminal organizations, operating across multiple states and countries. Far from being separate individuals who had each made poor choices, they were integral participants in an international criminal network that generated hundreds of millions of dollars annually through human exploitation. This brings us to why your cooperation could be crucial for our investigation, Agent Chen continued. While we have sufficient evidence to prosecute your immediate family members, there are dozens of other participants in these networks who could escape justice if we can't gather additional information about their operations and relationships. Agent Foster explained that my family's knowledge of the criminal networks extended far beyond their direct participation in money laundering, Medicare fraud, and insurance fraud. They had been attending meetings, coordinating activities, and maintaining relationships with criminal leaders throughout the Northeast and international. If you're willing to participate in controlled encounters with your family members, wearing recording devices and following conversation scripts that we develop, you could help us identify and prosecute criminal leaders who are currently beyond our reach, Agent Foster said. Your family trusts you, or at least they believe they can manipulate you into protecting them. That trust could be leveraged to gather evidence that would otherwise be impossible to obtain. The request to become an active participant in the investigation against my family was emotionally overwhelming, but the agents gave me time to process what they were asking before continuing with their presentation. We understand that this is an enormous decision, Agent Chen said gently. You would essentially be helping us build cases against people you've loved your entire life, but we want you to understand the stakes involved in these criminal enterprises and the impact that successful prosecutions could have on protecting future victims. Agent Williams returned to her presentation, showing me photographs and case files of victims who had been trafficked, exploited, and murdered by the criminal networks my family participated in. Young women from Honduras and Guatemala who had been promised restaurant jobs in Connecticut but were instead forced into sexual slavery. Elderly patients who had trusted doctors like Emma to provide compassionate care but were instead subjected to unauthorized medical experiments. Families who had paid insurance premiums for decades, believing they were protecting their children's futures, only to be abandoned when serious illnesses required expensive treatment. These are the people whose lives could be saved if we can successfully dismantle these criminal networks, Agent Williams said, her voice carrying the weight of law enforcement officers who had seen too much human suffering. Your family's cooperation with our investigation could prevent hundreds of future victims from experiencing the exploitation and violence that these organizations inflict. The moral clarity of the choice I was being asked to make was absolute, even though the emotional cost would be devastating. My family had chosen to profit from human suffering on a massive scale, and their continued freedom would enable the exploitation of countless additional victims. What exactly would you need me to do? I asked, surprised by the steadiness in my own voice. Agent Chen outlined a plan that would involve me participating in several recorded conversations with family members over the next week before the federal raids were executed. The conversations would be designed to gather information about criminal associates, the location of hidden assets, and the operational details of the various enterprises. We would provide you with sophisticated recording equipment and detailed scripts for each conversation, Agent Chen explained. You would have backup surveillance and immediate extraction capabilities if any of the encounters became dangerous. Your safety would be our absolute priority throughout the operation. The plan involved scheduling individual meetings with Jake, Emma, and my father under the pretense of wanting to discuss my career concerns and seek their advice about handling the pressures of investigative journalism. Each conversation would be structured to elicit specific information about their criminal activities, while appearing to be family discussions about my professional and personal challenges. Your family is already suspicious about how much you might know about their activities, Agent Foster noted. They're going to be watching for signs that you're cooperating with law enforcement. The success of these operations will depend on your ability to appear vulnerable and dependent on their guidance while actually gathering evidence that will be used to prosecute them. Marcus spoke for the first time during the meeting, addressing concerns about my safety during these controlled encounters. I'll be monitoring every conversation and maintaining visual contact throughout each meeting. We'll have extraction protocols in place if any family member becomes suspicious or aggressive. The logistics of the operation were complex but thorough. Each conversation would take place in a public location with multiple law enforcement personnel providing covert surveillance. I would be equipped with recording devices that were virtually undetectable, and backup systems would ensure that critical evidence wasn't lost due to technical failures. How long do I have to decide? I asked, though I already knew what my answer would be. We need your decision by tomorrow morning, Agent Chen replied, The raids are scheduled for next Monday, which gives us exactly 1 week to conduct the controlled encounters and gather additional evidence. As the meeting concluded and I reviewed the documents the agents provided for me to take home, I felt the weight of the decision settling on my shoulders. Agreeing to participate in the investigation would mean actively betraying people I had loved my entire life, but refusing would mean allowing criminals who had murdered children and trafficked vulnerable people to escape full accountability for their actions. That evening, Marcus and I sat in my apartment reviewing the materials the federal agents had provided and discussing the implications of the choice I was facing. "You don't have to do this," Marcus said, though his tone suggested he believed I should. "The agents have enough evidence to prosecute your family members even without your cooperation. Additional evidence would help them build stronger cases and potentially prosecute more participants, but it's not essential for basic justice." I thought about the photographs Agent Williams had shown me, the faces of trafficking victims who had been exploited by the networks my family participated in, the medical records of elderly patients who had been murdered for their organs, the insurance files of families who had been financially destroyed when coverage for their children's medical treatment was denied. "Those victims deserve justice," I said finally. "All of them, not just the ones whose cases can be proven without additional evidence. If I have the ability to help ensure that more criminals are prosecuted and more victims receive justice, how can I choose not to use that ability?" Marcus nodded, though his expression remained concerned. "Just remember that once you start down this path, there's no going back. Your relationships with your family members will be permanently destroyed, and you'll have to live with the knowledge that you played a direct role in their prosecutions." The truth was that my relationships with my family members were already destroyed. The people I had thought I knew and loved had never really existed. They had been carefully constructed personas designed to hide the reality of criminal entrepreneurs who profited from human suffering. The choice wasn't between preserving family relationships and pursuing justice, but between enabling continued criminal activity and helping to protect future victims. "I'll do it," I said, surprised by the certainty in my voice. "I'll cooperate with the investigation." The week that followed was the most surreal and emotionally exhausting period of my life. Monday through Friday, I met individually with Jake, Emma, and my father, wearing recording equipment and following conversation scripts designed to gather evidence about their criminal enterprise. Each conversation felt like a betrayal of family bonds, even though I understood that the real betrayal had been their decision to profit from human suffering while manipulating me for years. Jake's conversation took place at a coffee shop near his office, where he attempted to convince me to abandon my investigative work and join his financial practice. What he didn't know was that every word he spoke about the legitimate business opportunities available through his criminal associates was being recorded for use in his prosecution. Emma's meeting was held at a restaurant near Hartford Hospital, where she offered to connect me with pharmaceutical companies that could fund my documentary work. Her attempts to introduce me to the same companies involved in illegal medical experiments and organ trafficking provided federal investigators with detailed information about criminal operations they had been trying to penetrate for months. My father's conversation was the most emotionally difficult, taking place in the study of my childhood home while my mother prepared dinner in the kitchen. His offers to use his insurance industry connections to help me find safer work led him to reveal details about criminal associates and hidden assets that would prove crucial for the federal investigation. By Friday evening, I had helped federal investigators gather dozens of hours of recorded evidence and identify previously unknown participants in the criminal networks my family had been operating. The emotional cost of these deceptions was enormous, but the knowledge that this evidence would help prosecute people who had trafficked, murdered, and exploited vulnerable victims made the personal sacrifice worthwhile. The federal raids began at dawn on Monday morning. Marcus and I watched from my apartment as news reports showed FBI agents executing search warrants at my family's homes and businesses. By noon, Jake, Emma, and my father were in federal custody facing charges that could result in life sentences. The media coverage was extensive and devastating for my family's reputations, but it also validated the importance of the investigative work I had been doing. My trafficking documentary, which premiered at Sundance 2 months later, received widespread acclaim and helped generate public support for stronger law enforcement efforts against human trafficking networks. The Peabody Award I received 6 months after my family's arrest recognized not just my documentary work, but my cooperation with federal investigators in exposing criminal enterprises that had operated behind facades of professional respectability. Standing on the stage at the Peabody ceremony, accepting an award for journalism that had ultimately led to my own family's prosecution, I felt a complex mixture of pride and grief. The work had been worth doing, and justice had been served, but the personal cost had been immeasurable. In my acceptance speech, I spoke about the importance of holding criminals accountable regardless of their social status or family connections, and about the courage required to pursue truth even when that truth challenges our most fundamental assumptions about the people we love. Today, 3 years after those federal raids, my family members are serving lengthy prison sentences for their crimes. I've had no contact with them since their arrests, though my mother occasionally sends letters that I haven't opened. The criminal networks they participated in have been significantly disrupted, and dozens of additional criminals have been prosecuted using evidence gathered during the investigation. My career as an investigative journalist has flourished, built on a foundation of credibility earned through the most difficult professional and personal decisions I've ever faced. The victims whose stories I continue to tell know that I understand the cost of pursuing justice, and the sources who trust me with their information recognize someone who has proven willing to sacrifice personal relationships for the sake of truth. Marcus remains my security consultant and closest friend, though our relationship evolved into something deeper as we worked together to navigate the aftermath of my family's criminal exposure. His understanding of the choices I made, and the principles that guided those choices, created a bond stronger than any I had experienced with the family members who had manipulated and betrayed me for years. The woman who woke up on Easter morning, hoping for family approval and recognition, is gone forever, replaced by someone who understands that real integrity sometimes requires choices that feel like betrayal but are actually acts of profound loyalty to principles larger than family bonds. Sometimes being called an embarrassment to your family is really being called out for refusing to participate in systems of exploitation and violence that masquerade as respectability and success. The most important lesson I learned is that family loyalty doesn't mean protecting people from the consequences of their actions. It means holding them accountable to standards of decency and humanity that transcend blood relationships and social expectations. True love sometimes requires doing things that feel like betrayal but are actually the most loving acts possible. The courtroom was packed with journalists, federal agents, and family members of victims as Jake took the witness stand during his sentencing hearing. I sat in the back row, my press credentials allowing me access to proceedings that would determine my brother's fate for the next several decades. The man who had once dismissed my career as unstable and irresponsible now faced life in prison for crimes that had destroyed hundreds of lives. Judge Margaret Thompson presided over the hearing with the gravity befitting crimes of such magnitude. She had spent weeks reviewing evidence that detailed the full scope of the criminal enterprises my family had operated, and her questions to my brother revealed both her thorough understanding of the case and her horror at the human cost of his actions. "Mr. Johnson," Judge Thompson said, her voice carrying the weight of judicial authority, "the evidence presented in this case demonstrates that your money laundering operation facilitated human trafficking that resulted in the sexual exploitation of over 400 victims, including minors, as young as 14 years old. Do you understand that your financial crimes enabled some of the most serious violations of human dignity that this court has ever encountered?" Jake's response was barely audible, a mumbled acknowledgement that carried none of the confidence and arrogance that had characterized his interactions with me throughout our lives. The expensive suit he wore couldn't disguise the fact that he was now a convicted felon who would spend most of his remaining years in federal prison. The prosecutor, Assistant
Attorney Maria Rodriguez presented victim impact statements that brought the human cost of Jake's crimes into stark focus. A young woman named Carmen testified about being trafficked from El Salvador with promises of restaurant work in Hartford, only to be forced into prostitution at massage parlors, whose profits were laundered through Jake's investment account. The money this man cleaned for my traffickers paid for the apartment where I was held prisoner for 8 months, Carmen said, her voice steady despite the trauma she was recounting. Every dollar he processed represented another day of my captivity, another client I was forced to serve, another piece of my humanity that was stolen from me. Carmen's testimony was followed by statements from family members of construction workers who had died in accidents at job sites operated by companies whose illegal profits Jake had laundered. These workers had been denied safety equipment and proper training because providing such protections would have reduced the profit margins that made the laundering operation financially attractive to Jake and his criminal associates. Maria Rodriguez presented financial evidence showing that Jake had personally profited by over $8 million from his money laundering activities, using these proceeds to maintain his lifestyle while victims of the criminal enterprises he enabled suffered in conditions of slavery and exploitation. The defendant presented himself to his community as a respected financial advisor who helped families secure their futures, Rodriguez said in her sentencing recommendation. In reality, he was a sophisticated criminal who facilitated some of the most serious violations of human rights that federal law enforcement has encountered in this jurisdiction.
Judge Thompson sentenced Jake to 45 years in federal prison without the possibility of parole, a sentence that effectively meant he would die behind bars. As the gavel fell, I felt a complex mixture of satisfaction that justice had been served, and grief for the brother I had thought I knew, but who had apparently never existed. Emma's sentencing hearing took place the following week in the same courtroom, but the emotional atmosphere was even more intense due to the nature of her crimes. The families of elderly patients who had been murdered during unauthorized medical experiments filled the gallery, their presence a powerful reminder of the human cost of her actions. Dr. Patricia Williams, a medical ethics expert who had reviewed Emma's case files, testified about the systematic nature of my sister's crimes and their violation of fundamental principles of medical practice. Johnson deliberately targeted the most vulnerable patients in her care, elderly individuals who trusted her with their lives and their medical decisions. Dr. Williams explained to Judge Thompson, she exploited that trust to conduct illegal experiments that she knew would likely result in death, and she did so for financial gain rather than any legitimate medical purpose. The prosecution presented evidence showing that Emma had received over $3 million in payments from pharmaceutical companies for her participation in unauthorized experiments, and an additional $2 million from organ trafficking networks for facilitating the harvesting of organs from patients who died during these procedures. One of the most devastating pieces of evidence was a recorded conversation between Emma and a pharmaceutical company representative, obtained through the federal wiretaps that had been authorized during the investigation. In the recording, Emma discussed strategies for identifying patients whose deaths would be less likely to trigger family questions or medical investigations. "We want the ones without close family support," Emma could be heard saying on the recording. "Elderly patients whose children live far away, or who don't have children at all, people who won't be missed immediately, and whose deaths can be attributed to natural causes or complications from existing conditions." The calculated cruelty in Emma's voice as she discussed selecting victims for murder was shocking even to family members who had attended every day of the trial proceeding. This wasn't a medical professional who had made poor ethical choices under pressure. This was a predator who had systematically identified and exploited vulnerable patients for financial gain. Margaret Santos, whose 83-year-old father had been one of Emma's victims, delivered a victim impact statement that left few dry eyes in the courtroom. "My father trusted Dr. Johnson completely," Margaret said, her voice breaking with emotion. "He used to tell me how lucky he felt to have such a caring doctor who took personal interest in his case. He had no idea that her personal interest was in how much money she could make from killing him and selling his organ." Margaret's father had been a retired teacher who had spent his final years volunteering at a literacy program for immigrant families. Emma had selected him for unauthorized experimental procedures specifically because he lived alone and had limited contact with family members who might question the circumstances of his death. The experiments Dr. Johnson conducted on my father served no legitimate medical purpose. Margaret continued. She injected him with compounds that she knew would cause organ failure, then harvested his liver, kidneys and corneas for sale to black market organ broker. She literally murdered my father and sold his body parts for profit. The evidence against Emma was so overwhelming and disturbing that even her defense attorney struggled to present mitigating arguments. The best he could offer was that Emma had been suffering from financial pressures that had influenced her judgment, though the prosecution quickly demonstrated that her crimes had begun during periods when she was already earning substantial income from her legitimate medical practice. Judge Thompson sentenced Emma to life in prison without the possibility of parole, making her the first medical professional in Connecticut history to receive such a severe sentence for crimes committed against patients. The judge noted that Emma's violation of medical ethics was so profound that it warranted the harshest possible punishment under federal law. Johnson took an oath to do no harm, but instead she systematically murdered vulnerable patients for financial gain. Judge Thompson said as she delivered the sentence. Her crimes represent a betrayal not just of individual patients who trusted her, but of the entire medical profession and the principles that govern ethical healthcare. My father's sentencing hearing was delayed by several months due to the complexity of calculating the full scope of his insurance fraud crimes and their impact on victims. The State Insurance Commission had identified over 5,000 cases where legitimate claims had been denied, based on my father's systematic policies of discrimination against vulnerable populations. When his hearing finally took place, the courtroom was filled with families whose lives had been destroyed by his company's practices, parents who had watched their children die from treatable diseases because insurance coverage had been denied, elderly individuals who had lost their homes trying to pay for medical care that should have been covered by policies they had paid into for decades. The most powerful testimony came from Rebecca Martinez, whose 6-year-old daughter had died from diabetes complications after my father's company denied coverage for insulin and monitoring equipment. Johnson personally reviewed my daughter's case and approved the denial. Rebecca testified, holding a photograph of her daughter that she had brought to the hearing. The company policy required executive approval for any denial involving a child's life-threatening condition, which means he knew that rejecting our claim would likely result in Elena's death. Rebecca's daughter had died at home during a diabetic episode that could have been prevented with proper medical equipment and medication. The family had exhausted their savings trying to pay for treatment, and Elena had died 2 days before they would have received approval for a second mortgage that might have funded her continued care. My daughter died because this man decided that his company's profits were more important than her life, Rebecca continued, her voice steady despite the tears streaming down her face. He looked at paperwork that documented a 6-year-old child's medical emergency and decided that letting her die was better for business than paying the claim her family had been promised. The prosecution presented internal company documents showing that my father had developed specific algorithms designed to identify and deny claims from the most vulnerable population. These algorithms prioritized rejections of claims from single mothers, elderly individuals without family support, and families with disabled children, based on statistical analysis showing that these groups were least likely to have resources to fight denials through legal channels. Assistant Attorney David Park presented evidence showing that my father's systematic denial of legitimate claims had resulted in at least 200 preventable deaths over a 5-year period, and had caused financial devastation for thousands of families who had trusted his company to provide promised coverage during medical emergencies. The defendant didn't just commit insurance fraud, Park argued during his sentencing recommendation. He committed systematic murder by deliberately denying medical coverage to people he knew would die without treatment. His crimes were motivated by pure greed and demonstrated a complete disregard for human life. Judge Thompson sentenced my father to 38 years in federal prison, noting that his crimes had been particularly heinous because they had exploited people during their most vulnerable moments and had resulted in preventable deaths of children and elderly individuals. Johnson built his business model around the systematic denial of legitimate insurance claims to the most vulnerable members of our society, Judge Thompson said as she delivered the sentence. His actions resulted in the deaths of children who could have been saved, and the financial destruction of families who had paid for protection that was deliberately withheld during their greatest time of need. The completion of all 3 sentencing hearings marked the end of the legal proceedings against my immediate family members, but it was far from the end of the broader investigation into the criminal networks they had participated in. Over the following months, federal agents used evidence gathered during my family's prosecutions to identify and arrest dozens of additional participants in human trafficking, organ harvesting, and money laundering operations. Miguel Santos, the construction company owner who had been laundering money through Jake's practice, received a life sentence for human trafficking charges related to the forced labor of over 300 undocumented workers. Several of these workers testified about conditions that constituted slavery, including confiscated identification documents, substandard housing, and threats of violence against family members who remained in their home country. The pharmaceutical companies involved in Emma's illegal medical experiments faced corporate criminal charges that resulted in billions of dollars in fines and the dissolution of several organizations that had been conducting unauthorized research on vulnerable populations. Federal regulators discovered that these companies had been operating similar programs in multiple states, using corrupt medical professionals to conduct experiments that would have been illegal under normal clinical trial protocol. David Park, the financial operations manager who had coordinated money laundering activities with Jake, cooperated with federal investigators in exchange for a reduced sentence. His testimony led to the identification of international money laundering networks that had been operating throughout North America and Europe, facilitating not just human trafficking, but also drug distribution and weapons smuggling operations. The success of the federal investigation was recognized with congressional testimony from several of the lead agents, who used my family's case as an example of how sophisticated criminal enterprises could operate behind facades of professional respectability. Agent Rebecca Chen testified that the investigation had been possible only because of cooperation from witnesses who were willing to prioritize justice over family loyalty. The Johnson family case demonstrates that some of the most serious criminal enterprises in our society are operated by individuals who appear to be respected professionals, Agent Chen told the House Judiciary Committee during hearings on organized crime. These criminals use their professional credentials and social status to avoid suspicion, while committing crimes that are as serious as any violence committed by traditional organized crime groups. Agent Chen's testimony included specific mention of my cooperation with the investigation, though she was careful to protect my identity during the public hearing. She noted that witness cooperation from family members had been essential for gathering evidence about criminal networks that would otherwise have remained hidden behind professional facades. The congressional hearings resulted in new legislation that strengthened federal oversight of financial services, medical practice, and insurance operations, with specific provisions designed to detect the kinds of systematic fraud that my family had been committing. The legislation was named the Vulnerable Populations Protection Act, and it included requirements for enhanced background checks and ongoing monitoring of professionals who worked with elderly patients, undocumented immigrants, and other vulnerable groups. My own career underwent a dramatic transformation following the completion of my family's prosecution. The trafficking documentary that had been accepted by Sundance received widespread distribution and critical acclaim, winning several additional awards and generating significant public interest in human trafficking issues. The success of the documentary led to opportunities for larger projects with major networks and streaming platforms. More significantly, my cooperation with federal investigators had established my credibility as a journalist who was willing to pursue truth, regardless of personal cost. Sources who had been reluctant to trust me with sensitive information began reaching out with stories about corruption and criminal activity in various industries and institutions. One of the most important investigations that grew out of contacts made during my family's case involved a network of private prisons that had been using inmates as forced labor for manufacturing operations. The investigation revealed that several Fortune 500 companies had been purchasing products made by prisoners who were paid less than 50 cents per hour, while prison corporations profited from contracts worth millions of dollars annually. The private prison investigation led to a documentary series that aired on Netflix and generated significant policy discussions about prison reform and corporate responsibility. The series won a Peabody Award
Award and established my reputation as one of the leading investigative journalists working on issues related to human exploitation and corporate crime. Marcus and I married 2 years after my family's sentencing hearings, in a small ceremony attended by colleagues from the journalism community and law enforcement officials who had worked on the investigation. Our relationship had been forged through the most difficult period of my life, and our shared commitment to justice and protecting vulnerable people created a foundation stronger than any I could have imagined during my years of seeking approval from family members who were secretly exploiting the people I was trying to protect. Our wedding was covered by several journalism trade publications, not because of celebrity interest but because our relationship represented a unique partnership between investigative journalism and law enforcement that had resulted in significant successes in combating organized crime. Several of the federal agents who had worked on my family's case attended the ceremony, along with some of the victims whose testimony had been crucial for securing conviction. Carmen, the trafficking victim who had testified at Jake's sentencing hearing, attended our wedding and spoke about how the investigation had helped her rebuild her life. She had received asylum status in the United States and was working with other survivors to identify and rescue current trafficking victims. Her presence at our wedding represented the positive outcomes that had grown from the devastating process of exposing my family's crime. The third anniversary of my family's arrests was marked by a retrospective article I wrote for the Columbia Journalism Review about the ethical challenges faced by journalists whose investigations intersect with their personal relationship. The article discussed the decision-making process I had gone through when choosing to cooperate with federal investigators, and the ongoing impact of those choices on my professional and personal life. The most difficult lesson I learned during this experience was that family loyalty and moral responsibility are not always compatible. I wrote in the article, sometimes protecting people you love means enabling them to continue harming others, and sometimes real love requires holding people accountable for actions that violate fundamental principles of human dignity. The article generated significant discussion within the journalism community about the boundaries between personal relationships and professional obligations. Several journalism schools began using my family's case as a teaching example in courses on ethics and investigative methodology. Today, 5 years after that Easter brunch when my world changed forever, I continue to work as an investigative journalist focusing on human trafficking, corporate crime, and systematic exploitation of vulnerable populations. My family members remain in federal prison, serving sentences that will likely keep them incarcerated for the rest of their lives. I have received occasional letters from my mother, though I haven't opened them. Marcus suggested that reading them might provide closure, but I'm not ready for whatever justifications or manipulations they might contain. The woman who raised me, who taught me to tie my shoes and helped with homework, was married to a man who systematically murdered children for profit. Some wounds require time to heal, and some relationships may never be salvageable. The ripple effects of my family's crimes continue to emerge in unexpected ways. Last month I received a call from a prosecutor in Florida who was investigating similar insurance fraud schemes and wanted to discuss patterns they had identified. It seems my father's methods had been copied by other insurance executives, creating a nationwide network of companies that were systematically denying legitimate claims to boost profit. My documentary work has expanded beyond human trafficking to examine the broader systems that enable exploitation of vulnerable people. The connections between legitimate businesses and criminal enterprises that I first discovered through my family's activities have become a central focus of my investigative work. There's something darkly ironic about the fact that my family's betrayal led me to understand these systems more deeply than I ever could have otherwise. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.